I had very much been living a life of sin, and very much it was all about me. Just the lifestyle and the friends that I had and the path that I was going on led me to hit rock bottom. And rock bottom for us was that we both ended up getting incarcerated. To be fair, Jen really didn't do anything that would warrant that. And it was just really my actions and my behaviors and things that I have done that led to that. And that weight was heavy and I couldn't bear it. She also was 6 or 7 months pregnant with our first child. So the heaviness that I was going to, as a husband, put my wife in a situation where she was going to be separated from our child was too much to bear. And I had reached out to my uncle. My uncle had his own story, and he had been walking with the Lord for some time at this point. And I called him and I just unloaded and just shared the mess that I got us in at that moment. And he responded in love, and he responded with scripture, and it just clicked. I immediately just accepted God's forgiveness, and it was honestly like grace like rain. And just the emotion, I literally woke Jen up at 1 or 2 in the morning, and I mean, I was just in tears, and I just grabbed onto that hope, and I said, you have to hear the good news that I just heard. And I just shared with Jen what he told me, and I think I put her on speakerphone. And that next day, I woke up and I said, I believe, but at that point, I'm like, okay, we need a Bible, we need to find a church. And I was just all in at that point.
Like Mark said, we got a Bible and we started going to church, and just from that point on, we were all in. And just in every aspect of our life, I think we just had our faith in Christ and followed him from then on out.
He opened up doors, even in prison, with some ministry opportunities, and I was leading a Bible study with a good solid group of men. So through that time away, we were in God's Word, and we were just knowing how much he came through for us and his presence, and we just had hope for our future, not just for our current situation. But I saw God's church really demonstrate love in that season. We had a just godly couple that would bring our son and come and visit us, a few hours away, week in and week out, and they hardly knew us. In my story, I always used to tell people, yes, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, but as I've been reflecting lately, God's church did that, because there's so many people that touched us, and we are so grateful. And they were not just part of our local church, but God's church. And we saw God's church actually in action and loving and caring on us, and actually visiting us and really seeing his command to love the least of these, because that's how we felt with where we were and what I put us through. We really felt like the least of these, and we've seen God's church come through for us. We came to trust God not knowing how it would look. We didn't know anything about tithing. We didn't grow up in the church. We didn't know what it meant to give.
Whenever we first started talking about tithing and everything, it was kind of hard. I mean, he definitely was all in, and just not so much me. I'm very stingy, sad to say, with my money. At first, I was like, anytime he's like, okay, let's write a check, and I'm just like, which is not good to do, but just as we continued to do it, it was just amazing to see the things that came out of it, and just little things here and there. The more these little things happen, the more that mindset of that's my money and I'm stingy with it just kind of vanished. And we just kind of totally got on the same page of that's not my money, that's not his money, that's God's money. God gave us that money, and he just continued just to bless us and bless us.
God had given us so much, and his church loved us so much. We had no other route to take than to go all in, not only with our tithes and offering, but also with serving. It's her and I, it's in our heart to serve God's church because God's church served us. A month or two after we had made the decision to tithe and to move forward in that in our life, I was in a sales job, and they announced that they were going to double the commission for the top 3 people in the center. There was about 600 people. And it was just a crazy thing. I just knew I was going to do it because I just knew that we were being obedient and faithful, and I was number 1 out of about 600 people. And I'm not saying that to gloat. I'm not the best speaker. I'm not the most gifted salesperson. It's just all glory to God. He provided for us in ways that we had no doubt that it was him. And there's story upon story that her and I could share with you that is just true about how he's come through in our life. Through our life, when we look at the snapshots of our life and our marriage, God has always come through, whether it be a job that we needed, a vehicle that we needed, the boys' school, favor at their school, favor at our workplaces, a car breaking down and someone just giving us a vehicle, new tires, the list goes on. And I look at that as God getting the glory for that because it's his church. People are doing this because they're loved by him and they pour that out. We have stood firm in our faith. We have trusted God through our giving, through our serving. He has never failed us. He has never left our side. He is more real to us today than he's ever been. And we are just so grateful and thankful for his presence in our life.
So God does this incredible thing in Mark and Jed's life. I mean, from where they were at to where they are now. I mean, take a second just to think about that. At one point in their lives, Mark just came out and admitted it. Like, my life was all about me. I was fully selfish. And then God brought them to a place of rock bottom. Not just a place of rock bottom, but a place that was unbearable for him. I mean, think about this. He knows that he's facing 4 or 5 years of incarceration, and now he's got his wife in trouble, and she's actually pregnant, and they're trying to figure out how to make this whole thing work. And it's incredible where you look at where Mark and Jen were and how God carried them through. And it reminds me of what God did in Moses' life. Remember, when we go back 2 weeks ago, when we talked about Moses, he had it all, but then he messed up. And then he found himself not able to really be an Egyptian, not really able to be an Israelite, not really fitting in, down to absolutely nothing out in the middle of the desert. And God brought him new hope. And God did that for Mark. He called his uncle, and his uncle began to tell him about the new hope that could be found in Christ. Some of us today, we need to go to that well. Remember that time when we met God for the first time, and I think it'll pump us up. I think it will revive us in an incredible way. The last 2 weeks in the All In series, we've had 2 big ideas. And the first big idea was we took a look at our lives. We took a look at our backstory, at our timeline to say that God has put us all together for a time, at a place, for a purpose. And in week 2, we learned that God doesn't force us, but he invites us to participate or engage in what he is doing. Today's big idea is this. God calls us to take steps forward, to do difficult things to help us build our dependence on him. Now, the key word in this big idea, if you've got your all-in books out, the key word with this is the word dependence. Think about that word dependence. What does it mean to you? Who are you dependent on? Who is dependent on you? God actually created you and I. Get this. He created you and I to be dependent upon him. Man, that's hard for me to grasp. That's hard for me sometimes to understand. And it's hard for me to accept, but God designed us to be dependent on him. And just as Mark and Jen found themselves in an unbearable situation, when they learned to depend on God, he began to give them hope. Moses also was in a terrible position. He began to depend on God, and God gave him hope. Let's open up our Bibles to Exodus chapter 4, and we're going to look at verses 17 through 20. Exodus 4, verses 17 through 20. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. That was God speaking to Moses. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. Remember, Moses' first 40 years of his life, he was in the palace. He was living the high life. He was somebody. And now he is at the end of his next 40 years, where God totally changes the timeline, totally turns the page, and his life turns out something totally different than he ever would have imagined it to be. And so now we're going into a new period of time where God has reached his hand out to Moses to invite him to activate his faith, to say, follow me. Let me ask you a question today. Have you ever felt this type of a call that Moses is feeling? A call where you're uncomfortable, but you know that God is calling you to something else? I'll never forget when God called us back to St. Louis area, and we weren't guaranteed a whole lot of things. We were helping with a church plant that was meeting in an elementary school, and we weren't guaranteed much. We weren't sure what our income was going to be like, what our housing situation was going to be like, what our kids' school situation was going to be like. And here I was, 30. My wife was 28 or 29. We had 4 kids, and we went and we lived in my in-laws' basement. It kind of reminds me of Moses because, he had to live with his father-in-law and take over and manage the land and those types of things. I found myself in that position. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. And at first, it didn't really feel like I was succeeding or having any fruit from what I was doing. But what God was doing in that time is he was causing me to depend on him on a deeper level. Sometimes God's going to call you to do something, and it may not even turn out the way you want it to, but it's because he wants you to depend on him on a deeper level. Maybe some of you are being called on an opportunity to go on a mission trip. Maybe God's calling some of you to change your job or your career, your vocation. Maybe that means less pay. Maybe that means you don't know what the pay is going to look like. Maybe it's a high risk, but God's calling you to do it. Some of you, God may be calling you to relocate. Some of you, God may be calling you with this All-In series to give up some of the comforts in your life for something greater that God has in store for you. God did this amazing miracle in the life of Moses to spare his life. Do you remember Moses in the little boat that went down the Nile River? He did this incredible thing. And not only did that happen, but Moses' mom got to be his caretaker. Then Moses was raised in the palace. He was heir to the throne of Pharaoh. And then he loses everything. Then what happens? God opens a door for a new chapter of his life. Some of you are in that new chapter. Some of you are in that transition. But then God appears to Moses while he's tending his flocks, and he tells him what he wants to do through Moses. And it's pretty overwhelming. God tells Moses, I want to save my people, and I want to do it through you. Do you remember Moses' 3 excuses? The first excuse was, when I go to the Israelites, they won't believe me. There's no way. Have you ever felt that way? God's called you to do something in your heart and in your mind, and you're like, no, people aren't going to believe me. That's crazy. The second one, God gave him an answer. His second thought was, God, I'm not good enough. I'm not qualified. He was focused on his physical limitations. Has God ever called you to do something amazing, but you get so focused on your physical limitations that you just can't operate? And then God answers that. He does these miracles, and he says, I'll bring Aaron to help you, and he'll be with your mouth, and I will tell you what to speak with his mouth. And he said all of those things, and Moses had one more excuse. Do you remember what that excuse was? This is my excuse sometimes, and I know that it might be your excuse every once in a while. He says this, God, can you get somebody else? Can you just get somebody else? Because this is a really hard job and I don't feel like doing it. Have you ever been there before? God calls Moses and it becomes a turning point. This is the opportunity for Moses where he's posed an option. Am I going to just understand my faith, or am I actually going to activate my faith? There's a huge difference between understanding our faith and activating our faith. Do you activate your faith every single day? One of the best examples of that, I think, is a credit card. I've got one in my wallet. And you look at this credit card, and it's not worth a whole lot because until you actually call the credit card company. When you first get it in the mail, it's got the little sticker on there, and it says, call this to make sure your credit card works. If you don't call and you show up and you're like, I got money in the bank and I got credit, you go to Walmart and you try to buy something, what's going to happen? You're not going to be able to buy it. Why? Because you haven't activated your card. The same thing goes with our faith. If we don't activate our faith, then it's not going to be the real thing. Moses finds himself at a turning point, and God now sends him away from his family to go and to talk to Pharaoh. Remember what our big idea is? God calls us to take steps forward to do difficult things to help us build our dependence on him. Dependence on God requires faith. And dependence on God, if you want to know if you're dependent on God, just ask yourself, am I activating my faith? Am I living out my faith every day? Let's pick up now in Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. But Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. They take this huge step of faith. They're following God in obedience. And what happens? Pharaoh shoots them a big, fat no. Now, they kind of had an idea that Pharaoh was going to say no, but maybe in the back of their minds, they were thinking, I wonder if Pharaoh might say yes, and then this whole thing's going to get a whole lot easier. But that's not the case. Have you ever been in a spot where you know you've done the right thing, but you've been rejected for it? Some of you, it's school. Maybe you get made fun of in the locker room or in the hallway or in the classroom because you don't do a certain thing, or that you do the right thing and you feel rejected for it. Others of you, you've offered to help somebody with a need that they have, and it blows up in your face. They reject you. Others of you, you try to help someone. Maybe you've got some money and resources and somebody has a need, and they waste it. So now you have less money, and they're right back where they are. Others of you, you do what is best for your kids, and they hate you for it. Have you ever been there? Or you try to share your story about your faith, and it's a huge, epic fail. I remember trying to share my faith one time at Arby's, and I was just so incredibly awkward about it, but I knew God had called me to do it, and I had asked them a question about their faith, and it was so bad that, this lady went and got her manager to come talk to me. I went out and I took this step of faith, and I thought God called me to do it, and then I was like, oh, I'm never doing this again. That happens. That happens to us sometimes. When we put our necks out there, we do the right thing. But here's the truth that you need to understand. We should be faithful to do what God calls us to do, even when the results aren't what we had hoped. Did you catch that? We should be faithful to do what God calls us to do, even when the results aren't what we had hoped. Back to the story of Mark and Jen. After they had turned their lives around before they were incarcerated, they started to get involved in Bible studies and started to give and started to serve. They still had the consequences of their previous things that they had to deal with. And so now Jen is pregnant. She's getting ready to have a baby, and she was separated from her baby for 6 months. Can you imagine the pain and the challenge of that? Well, sometimes when we get to where we're doing the right thing, we still have past consequences that we also have to deal with. But the truth that we should be encouraged by is this: we should be faithful to do what God calls us to do. So far in Exodus 5, we see that Moses and Aaron, they're going to keep going. Check this out. In Exodus chapter 7, we're going to read verses 8 through 13. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, When Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. Remember that from last week? God did all those miracles in front of Moses when he was working through the burning bush. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servant, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned his wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same thing by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But check this out. Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. So once again, Moses and Aaron do exactly what God calls them to do, and what happens? It goes over like a lead balloon with Pharaoh, even after doing some miracles. Why do you think this is? I've got 3 ideas why I think sometimes things don't go our way, and I think, or God's way, but also why Pharaoh rejected and why this happened. My first reason is this. Pharaoh was prideful and threatened by Israel. I really think that Pharaoh wanted to be in charge. He wanted to be in control. He wanted to be God, and he feared letting go. Sometimes there are people in our lives that we try to help and we try to encourage, but they're not willing to let go. Another reason was that there was a competing counter message. Now, what do I mean by counter message? Well, Moses and Aaron do this incredible thing, these miracles. But then the world comes in and does miracles that seem to be equivalent. You see how God's message and his gospel can sometimes get confused because we've got the message and the hope of Jesus Christ, but the world has all these other things that they put their hope in. And a lot of times the world is yelling louder than we are, and so it gets confused. And so Pharaoh doesn't follow God because there's this counter message. And then the third reason is this. Pharaoh decided not to let the people go because it wasn't God's will. God already knew that Pharaoh was going to say no. And Moses and Aaron were told that Pharaoh was going to say no. Now, this sounds kind of harsh, and it sounds kind of unfair to the Pharaoh, the fact that God had hardened Pharaoh's heart. But we also need to consider a few things about Pharaoh before we start feeling sorry for him. The first thing is that Pharaoh was an evil and godless man to begin with, a harsh dictator that threatened the Israelites. He treated God's people like animals. Secondly, on at least a couple occasions, Pharaoh, instead of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh chose to harden his own heart. We see that in Exodus chapter 8. So there were times when it was Pharaoh's choice. And the third thing is that there are times, sometimes in our lives, when we're so convinced that we want the right thing to happen and we want it to happen now. Have you ever been there? Like, God, I know what the right thing is and I want it to happen now. Sometimes it's praying for our finances to get better. Sometimes it's praying for physical healing. Sometimes it's praying for relational restoration. Sometimes it's praying for injustices to be corrected, problems to be solved. And we're praying for the right things, but God hasn't done it yet. And Moses and Aaron are here asking for the right things, but God has chosen not to do it yet. And I think many of you feel that tension today. But it doesn't stop Moses and Aaron from continuing in their faith. Regardless of the outcome, Moses and Aaron continue to follow God. And they continue to prove that they have a dependence on God. How about you today? Do you have a dependence on God? Our big idea is that God calls us to take steps forward to do sometimes difficult things to help us to build our dependence on him. You know, as we go through this all-in series, and right now we're in the middle of like a pandemic, and finances are going crazy with people, and people are getting laid off, and all this stuff, and we ask the question, God, why now? Why are we trying to do all this now? Well, we know that God has called us to move in a direction. It might not look exactly like we thought it would, but he's calling us to something that's even better than this all-in project. And you know what it is? A dependence on him. God continues to say, depend on me. He desires a relationship with you. Moses and Aaron were doing the right thing here. There's hundreds of other times where they're not doing the right thing, though. They're not the superheroes in this story. So don't hear me say, be like Moses and Aaron, because you and I can relate to Moses and Aaron very well. But what I'm trying to encourage you to do is to be dependent on God. Activate your faith, believing in him. So the story continues. God begins to send these what are called plagues, these curses upon all the people of Egypt. There ends up being 10 of those plagues, and for time's sake, I'm not going to go through all of them. But what happens is God brings the plagues, Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh thinks about it for a second, and he's like, nope, I'm not going to let my people go. And then it happens again. Another plague comes, and Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and Moses is like, Pharaoh's like, that's pretty bad, but no, I'm not going to let my people go. And there are times where Pharaoh's really thinking hard about it. But the final plague is the worst of all of them. Moses and Aaron led the Israelites to a greater dependence on God, and God would bring one final plague to Egypt. It was the death of the firstborn son. Can you see the irony in this? Egypt, remember this, 80 years ago? Egypt demanded that thousands of baby boys would be killed. Now God is returning a very harsh favor because Egypt had continued to reject God. So God lays out this instruction, and it's an instruction of dependence on him. God says, hey, children of Israel, if you really believe in me, you'll do this. And so what does God call them to do? Sacrifice a lamb. And it sounds kind of weird, but this is what God called them to do. Take the blood of the lamb, paint it above the doorframe of your house. And if you have the blood of the lamb over the doorframe of the house, the death angel will pass over your house and your firstborn son will live. But those of you that don't have a dependence on God, those of you that don't activate your faith, the firstborn son will die. So the angel of death comes and takes hundreds of lives, including the firstborn son of the Pharaoh. God gives an instruction to Israel, and they respond in a way of dependence, in a way of activating their faith. This is what it says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 28. Then the people of Israel went and did so. That's what God asked them to do. They did so. As the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. I ask this question today. What was the difference? What was the real difference between those that saw their firstborn son die and those that didn't? Was it because of their traditions? Was it because of their culture? Was it actually even because of their nationality? Was it because they understood things in their head? No, the difference was those were the people that activated their faith and showed dependence on him. There may have been children of Israel that didn't do it. I don't know. There may have been some Egyptians that got word of it and decided they wanted to join in with the Israelites and paint some blood over the doorpost and start to worship that God. I don't know. The one thing I do know is there's a difference between an understanding faith and an activating faith. Let me ask you today, do you have an understanding faith which isn't really real? I mean, you could sing along with a song. You could say, Jesus is my homeboy. You could know all the Bible verses and all the songs, but are you really following God with your life? That's the question. God wanted them to prove their dependence on God by activating their faith. None of these people were superheroes. Moses and Aaron had messed up hundreds of times in their lives. And let me tell you, I have messed up hundreds of times. I am a hot mess. You should have seen us all scrambling, our media team and us, as we were having these technical issues, trying to get Facebook Live up and going. And it's going to get better every week, by the way. But man, we're just, all of us, we're just a hot mess, right, folks? Yeah, we're just all a hot mess. Hey, there are times when I've done the wrong thing. I've even done it on purpose. There have been times when I've lacked faith. There have been times where I've made poor decisions. There have been times when I've hurt people. There have been times when I've been unfaithful. There have been times when I've been lazy. There have been times when I've had tons of doubt. Regardless of where I've been and regardless of where you've been, God stretches out his hand to say, will you depend on me? You and I, we can get looking around and checking our Facebook and watching the news, and we could get so caught up in this pandemic. We could get so caught up in this economy, but God is saying, hold on. It's okay to be concerned. It's okay to have plans. It's okay to be smart. But at the same time, I need you to depend on me. I love what Mark and Jen shared in their life, the things that they learned in their walk with God after going from rock bottom to serving God faithfully. This is what they said. We came to trust God not knowing what it would look like. What is that? We came to trust God not knowing what it would look like. You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like dependence. Jen started to talk about serving and giving. She's like, at first, I was really stingy about it. Can any of us relate? You get to looking at this and that. How can I do this? How can I afford this? How am I going to have time for this? But after taking the step of dependence, God made a way. Let me tell you, if we learn to grow in our giving, you know what we're actually learning to grow in? Dependence. Our giving to the Lord is equivalent to what our dependence is. So here's a result. This is what they said at the end of the video. I love this. They said, God is more real today in our lives than he's ever been. Is that what you want? Or does God feel distant? Do you feel like your prayers don't get past the ceiling? Some of you today need to just say, God, I've been trying to do this thing on my own so much. Lord, today I'm going to depend on you. God had this huge calling for Moses, this huge calling for Aaron. And it was about setting God's children free. But ultimately, God does this because he wants to build a relationship with Moses. He wants to build a relationship with Aaron. And God does the things he does because he wants to build a relationship with you. Why do you think we exist in the first place? Did God need us? No. God had everything he ever could have wanted, but he desired a relationship with you. And what he asks is that you put your dependence on him and you activate your faith. God calls us to take steps forward to do difficult things that will help us build our dependence on him. So what do our next steps look like today? Some of you, if this is your first time here, we have what's called a digital connection card. Not first time here, but like first time watching. We have a digital connection card. You can go to connectchurchstl.com and then click the New Here tab and fill out that connection card if you'd like for us to get to know you. But some of you want to message us on Facebook. Send us a message if you feel like you want to pray with someone about activating your faith. If you have a prayer need or anything like that. Some of you today, just put message me on the comments in your Facebook Live. We will follow up with you. We want to do whatever we can to help you grow in your connection to God and build your dependence on him.